Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comet Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. The C word in our culture stands for cancer, and it's one of the most common diseases in so many contexts and is certainly a thread of many conversations and people I've known and most of you listening have known over the years. Today, we have the great privilege of having Dr. Selwyn Vickers, who is the president and CEO of Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City, as our guest on Conversing. He is himself a cancer specialist and researcher of great distinction over many, many years, and has been a particular specialist in the area of pancreatic cancer. Having him on today gives us an opportunity to explore where we are in cancer treatment and in the implications of a disease that is so common and in which there is both great sadness and pain and loss, but also increasingly medical hope. Welcome, Selwyn. It's so great to have you today on Conversing.
Thank you, Mark. I'm excited to be here.
You know, I've invited you as a guest because one of the most common human experiences in North America and probably in many places around the world is an ongoing undercurrent of conversation about cancer. Mm-hmm. It's just so pervasive. And this is your specialty. It's the specialty of Sloan Kettering. And it's one of the most important existential experiences that many encounter and experience. And it's also one of the most important areas of medical research. And I can't think of anyone better to have a chance to talk to about this complicated reality than you. So let's just start first on a bit of a personal level. How did it happen that you came into medicine? And then why, in particular, did you go into cancer research?
So like many kids trying to sort out what they wanted to do, I had the fortune to have an uncle who was a physician. I had a chance to sort of observe his career and go to his medical school graduation in 1972. He was one of 3 or 4 African Americans that graduated in his class at the University of Cincinnati. And then I had a chance to visit him as a practitioner. And that really sealed the deal. As a 15-year-old, I saw 2 things that really stuck in my mind. I saw him in an emergency room with a young girl who really had an anxiety attack, but he was able to get her calm by, in this case, helping her slow her breathing and to actually get her without much medicine to respond to just basic therapy. Made a big difference. And then he took me to a patient's room who was admitted to the hospital. And this was an elderly Black man who had come to his clinic for 3 to 4 years. He was really short of breath. Nobody had quite figured it out, but my uncle, who was a family practitioner, listened and heard a really pronounced systolic murmur, which is the sign, in this case, of aortic stenosis, and got this man to a cardiologist, got him to a surgeon, had his aorta repaired by having a valve put in. And my uncle wasn't the surgeon. He was just the initial person who made the diagnosis. And this man was really in tears, thanking my uncle for getting him to a cardiologist and then to a surgeon. That was huge, and it meant a great deal. So from a 15-year-old who had an uncle who had a Porsche and could make a difference in somebody's life, that was like, okay, this is what I want to do.
Yeah, exactly. Now there's a combination I could imagine being drawn into.
People are really thanking him immensely, and then he has a really nice car. So for a 15-year-old, that was big.
That was very, very big. Yeah. How great. Well, your own focus of research has been on pancreatic cancer, but before we come to that, which I do want to ask about, It's very hard for people, for any of us, to get a grasp of the scene of cancer research. We know there's been major breakthroughs, huge improvements, incredible amount of hope in certain areas and kinds of cancers. Other places, much more resistant, much more difficult, harder to see the same kinds of breakthroughs. So I wonder if you could just paint a picture of the state of cancer research, as audacious as that question is.
That's a great question, Mark. I think we're in what some would coin the golden age of cancer research. I think probably in 2010, we began, if you would, just begin to walk through the door with the sequencing of the human genome. And that opened the door for precision oncology. And what that meant across any multiple things, we could ask, what role did your genes play in whatever disease that you had? And that's still a factor in many aspects of our healthcare, whether it's memory loss, whether it's cardiac disease or kidney disease or pulmonary issues. But it's no more pronounced an impact than in cancer. So we can ask that question of almost any cancer that we get. What went wrong in that cell to create this ability to grow in an unbridled way that led to a tumor that may either grow in large size or metastasize?
Right.
And so that ability, and Memorial was one of the first places to systemically sequence the tumors that patients had and ask the question, is there a drug that might target the mutation that ended up creating your cancer? Now, to be clear, two groups of mutations. Germ cell mutations are those that are inherited, and only about 2 to 3% of cancers are driven by inherited disease. The mutations that we speak about most often are called somatic mutations, and they are acquired over the time period of our lives. And so there are these mutations in our tumors that occur over time from environmental exposure, sometimes viruses, that drive a cell to now become an unbridled growth cell that actually leads to what we would call cancer. So first, sequencing the genome now is like the precision oncology. The next thing that occurred that is in the last probably 10 years is this idea of immunotherapy. And again, Memorial played a vital role. And there are three really broad categories. First is this idea of checkpoint inhibition. And that is scientists discovered that the immune cells in general are geared toward fighting anything that they perceive as foreign. But cancer cells can sometimes cloak themselves from the immune system in order to get their growth. And in fact, I say to people that if you have a cancer, more than likely your body has made a social contract with your immune system. We believe that there is a generalized immunosurveillance platform in almost all of us as humans where the immune system gets rid of random cells that have become malignant to grow, and it recognizes them as foreign and it kills them. It takes 1 billion cells to have a 1 centimeter tumor. And so that we believe that's frequently occurring. So if a tumor actually forms and gets that many cells to form a 1 centimeter mass, somehow it has escaped your immune system. So the first episode of checkpoint inhibition uncloaks the immune system to attack cells. It first started in melanoma. Now it's in multiple tumors that we give this checkpoint inhibitors that now can allow the T cells, which are one arm of the immune system that actually fights cancers, to now engage.
Right.
The other two parts are what we would call cellular therapy. And that's a scientist at Memorial was one of the first to design this engineering process of taking a person who now has often a liquid cancer, that is a leukemia, but taking a set of their normal cells and re-engineering them to actually go back and target and attack their tumors. So the cells are taken out of the body, they're re-engineered in a lab, grown up into the millions, and then are given back. And in that scenario, we've seen patients who had initially a 30% chance of survival been converted to an 80% chance of survival. Wow. And so cellular therapy, CAR T cells, so-called CAR T cells, are a powerful tool. And then the final piece of this picture is vaccines. And again, multiple places have played a role, but we most recently have had a really seminal breakthrough with a vaccine for pancreatic cancer. One of our young surgical scientists took a group of patients who had pancreatic cancer. Even with surgery, 92% of the patients had recurred and were dead at 2.5 years. So that's people who are not necessarily getting chemotherapy, but these were people who believed they had a chance to be cured, and 92% recurred. That's because we know in many tumors, there's something called minimal residual disease. Even though the doctor's taken it out, even though they can't detect any, you still have cancer cells around. And what Dr. Balachandran did was that he actually took each of these patients, sequenced their tumors, and actually discovered, if you would, 20 markers, new markers in and on their cells called neoantigens. These became the target points for the vaccine that was made in a company called BioNTech that made the COVID vaccine. And these cells, I should say, these vaccines are mRNA vaccines that are now coded to basically create a mimic of the cancer cell that your immune system responds to, that these antigens are wrong and they're abnormal. Once you give the vaccine, the immune system is now primed to look for anything that looks like these markers. And the patients who got treated, more than 80% are alive at 4 years.
My gosh.
So vaccines will play a vital role. Immunizing yourself against cancer is a significant future opportunity. Undergirding all of this, Mark, is that for the last 5 years, 90% of the data in all of healthcare has been created in that time period. And it's growing at such a pace that in 2 years, I'll say 90% of the data has been created.
Wow.
So that when we sequence a tumor, that's 1 billion bytes of data.
Right.
Our power to be able to actually choose these special antigens on the pancreatic cancer cells, our power to look at the genome of a cancer and figure out where you can attack it, is really not about looking under a microscope. It's about managing data. And the people who now help us in this space are called computational oncologists. That's somebody who's an expert in molecular biology, but also an expert in abstract math. That's the combination. And so probably those are the drivers of our future opportunities. Managing the power of data now with AI, immunotherapy that's tumor agnostic, that can go after any cancer.
Right.
And then being able to be more precise about where we can attack your tumors because we have the power to manage the data when we sequence your tumor like we haven't before. You know, we have the fortune, and this is complicated in the sense that we can't survive off of just the quaternary care where people are the last ditch of hope. We have to do some regular breast cancers or regular prostate cancers as well, and we do. But more often than not, we are the last option of resort for many people who have gone to a cancer center where competent people are, but they've been told there's nothing to be done. And there's a musician, Michael Wolff, who he's publicly shared how he was at one of the New York cancer centers, had a lymphoma that went away for a year or two, but then came back in a raging fashion, was told that there was really nothing to do. And then, by the way, somebody says, you need to go to Memorial before you give up. And he came, and probably, Mark, 10 to 12% of the time, we change the diagnosis of what a patient gets to either no cancer or to a different cancer. So in this case, we found that he had a really rare version of a sarcoma, not a lymphoma. And in fact, there were only a few places in the country that saw these patients. We saw more than anybody, and that was 10 a year, right? So there wasn't large numbers.
Right.
But his doctor basically did, as I said, they sequenced this tumor on our platform and found a target for an area that could potentially discombobulate the tumor. This target, there was a drug, a little brown pill, that was used for a dermatologic disorder. And his doctor told him, as he asked, has this been done before? No, you're the first. We know the drug is safe because it's used for other things. It's our belief, by virtue of knowing how the biology works and the mutation you have, that in fact, this drug would target your tumor. 2 months, he feels better. 3 months, his tumors are about 80% reduced. 6 months, he has no detectable tumor. He's
Oh my
7 years
gosh.
out now.
Oh my
And
gosh.
so sometimes the case is, my wife had a close friend in a Bible study that she was in who was 45 years old, 3 boys. She had a advanced colon cancer, treated at a local cancer center in New York and told she had 6 months to live. She came to Memorial and continued new drugs added every 6 months. And she got an additional 2.5 years.
Wow.
Didn't ultimately win. We had to suffer through her losing her life, but was so appreciative that she got much more than the 6 months she was promised, and
Yes,
had
yes.
2.5 years with her family, her boys, and her husband.
Yeah.
So those are often the scenarios we deal with, and we have some privilege because all we do as cancer is to think about how do we fight the most difficult ones, and then how do we actually take the ones that are actually common and give them a chance to be treated in the earliest and most aggressive way.
It's just remarkable, remarkable. So because pancreatic cancer is the one you just mentioned, and because it's also your specialization, tell us a bit about why pancreatic cancer. What was distinctive about pancreatic cancer that has made it so much more resistant than some other cancers, or so it would seem to me?
Yeah, so I think it's clearly a bad actor in many ways. When I started my training, 1 out of 4 people simply died from the operation. Let's forget the treatment and surviving the therapy, but 1 out of 4 never left the hospital and from the operation. Now that's improved dramatically, less than 1 or 2% mortality from the surgery. However, even with those mortality rates down to less than 1%, when I first treated my first 100 patients for pancreatic cancer, I could count on one hand how many I had still alive at 5 years. And then I clearly knew that surgery alone, as much as I enjoyed it, was necessary but insufficient. You needed many other opportunities from drugs, from therapies that can make a difference. So to answer your question in more detail is that pancreatic cancer, unfortunately, different than prostate, breast, presents at a late stage. Nearly 60% of the patients when they're diagnosed have metastatic disease. And then if you add those patients who have disease that's completely sort of around a major blood vessel, then you're talking somewhere around 70% of the patients when they're presented are inoperable. So you're starting really behind the 8 ball when the vast majority cannot get a curative approach. You add to that a tumor that has done a remarkable job of hiding itself from the immune system. It is so-called an immune cold tumor, because in this diagnosis of the effort that our surgical scientists did of designing the vaccine, his journey was to go back and look at, were there any long-term survivors? And there are a few, small number. What he found, though, is that those long-term survivors, when he looked at their blood, they had a hyperactivated immune system. When he looked at their tumors, they had a hyperinfiltrates of immune cells. And so it was clear that those people who got long-term survival, somehow their tumors had been discovered by the immune system. The vast majority of people who don't live long, their immune systems are ignoring their pancreatic cancer. So 1, it has a great job of escaping the immune system. Number 2, it has some powerful drivers of growth. 90% of pancreatic cancers are driven by a mutation in a gene called KRAS. And it's a common mutation across a quarter of the tumors in our body are driven by this mutation. None more lethal than pancreatic cancer. So 1, strong genetic drivers for growth and resistance. And only up until recently, this mutation was thought to be undruggable. And in the last 3 years, there are drugs that can attack KRAS, which is a game changer, escapes the immune system, and late detection and advanced presentation are the things that make it so difficult.
Right. Which also explains then, for example, why probably the development of any kind of pre-screening testing that could be done along the way has also been extremely difficult to be able to bring about.
I think the we're getting to a point where I think in the next 5 to 7 years, blood tests will become more accurate. By that, I mean they'll be more sensitive and specific. They'll tell you if you have something and you can be certain, and they'll tell you when you don't have something and you can be certain. And so we're getting closer. The other factor is, who do you screen, right? Is it everybody in America, or is it everybody just over 65? Having the ability, and right now there are AI platforms that can go through our medical records and look at enough correlative data and begin to select people who are at high risk. So
Yes.
one, as we get to a point now with AI and blood biopsies, we'll select those people who we know by their association, their family history, that they are at greater risk for pancreatic cancer. And at some point, we'll be able to say to them, you need to go get an MRI, because
Right.
we know that 100 people like you, 75 ended up developing pancreatic cancer.
Right, right. It was 10 years ago today on Good Friday that my friend Steve Hayner, who had been my lifelong closest friend for 43 years, was about to go into a busy Easter weekend, and just in a conversation that we had on the phone told me that he wasn't feeling well. And on the following Monday, he went in for examinations and testing. And by Wednesday, it had been determined that he had pancreatic cancer. And it took a little bit longer to discover and decide for sure that he was beyond the stage of having any surgery. And he died early the following year. And it's been, therefore, a cancer that I've felt particularly attached to, you might say, particularly alert to. And over the course of all the decades of my being a pastor, the number of people that have had cancer of all different kinds, as well as people in particular that have had pancreatic cancer, has just been a storyline, or a set of storylines that I've really followed closely. And I'm so grateful to hear that there are these breakthroughs that have happened. And I know in the case, for example, that many people who are listening to this would be aware that Tim Keller died of pancreatic cancer as well. And the testing and processes that he went through were much more advanced than Steve would have had available to him at the time of his own death. And yet it took his life as well, as it has so many people's lives that are known and lesser known. And it's to hear the research that's going on and the kind of category breakthroughs that are coming about is really quite an amazing encouragement.
So, Mark, it is, there's just countless stories of people who are in the prime of their lives, typically over 65, but they're at a stage where they're really, in some ways, are trying to enjoy the best years of their lives. And nothing that they can say they thought they've done to drive or bring this on. And in an insidious way, it's not like some red light goes on, or you got a limp in a leg or a bruise. It's just that I don't feel right. I feel some discomfort, or I have some persistent indigestion that won't go away, or I have a nagging pain in my back that bothers me. And you go in, and typically in that scenario, they will do an endoscopy. Oh, that looks normal. Then it's 2 weeks later, they'll do an ultrasound. Oh, your gallbladder is normal. And then finally, at about 3 months in this process, somebody gets a CAT scan, and lo and behold, there's either this mass in the middle of your pancreas, or this mass in the head of your pancreas, or this mass in the tail of your pancreas. And by the way, at least half of the people are going to have small masses in their liver that it's already spread. And in the world that we've lived in the past, that was unfortunately the process where your doctor at his best or her best helped you learn how to die, because there just weren't many good options. You could get treatment, but they could never tell you that this was going to do more than prolong. And everybody wanted to fight that battle with the hope that they would get something even greater than what was promised.
Yes, yes.
I think today we're getting to a point that we'll in the next 5 to 7 years, we'll have a much better chance to cure people, but we'll also have a better chance to make pancreatic cancer a chronic illness, right?
Wow.
It'll be like whack-a-mole. Okay, we've gotten a drug that attacks this segment of the tumors, and then you're free for about 2 or 3 years. You come back, you've been tested. Okay, we see another spot. We biopsy it. Oh, we know what that responds to. And if we get to a point where it's completely clear, boy, we're going to give you a vaccine. We know all the markers on your pancreatic cancer. We have the data, and now we're going to give you a vaccine to now employ your immune system to do what we couldn't do, is fight and keep your cancer from coming back.
I'm Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me. It's really extraordinary. At a time when science is in this awkward position, I'll just say, in our culture where there's debates around science, to hear what you're saying is just such an encouragement. And one of the reasons why science is just such an exceptionally important and valuable contribution and a gift from God, as I know we both believe.
I think so. In that sense, that I think in many ways, he's given man the privilege to discover those things that have been hidden. And over time, we've gradually uncovered huge opportunities to impact people's lives who go on to serve in many ways in a positive impact on society.
Right. Let's go to several other cancers that I just think would be interesting for people to hear about. So of all the cancers that could be discussed related to women, let's in particular focus on breast cancer. Give us the state of breast cancer.
So breast cancer is a great example of a win. And that is, we have a really important screening tool, and we've moved it earlier, depending on what your history. Women started getting mammographies at 35 years of age if they're higher risk. We also have a gene, BRCA1 and 2, that we know if you have that gene, you're going to certainly have a significant, if not completely high risk of getting breast cancer. So we can treat that in a prophylactic fashion. And then when you put all things like that together, if you get the diagnosis of breast cancer, you have a 90% chance to survive and beat it over a 5-year period of time.
Wow.
There are a few examples, the so-called triple negative breast cancers that are just as bad as pancreatic cancer. And they're triple negative because in general, breast cells have normal receptors that allow them to do their sort of regular physiological function. And cancers that are not completely deranged express those receptors because they still have some resemblance of being a breast cell, but they now grow in a sort of an uncontrolled way. And so they'll express progesterone receptor, they'll express the estrogen receptor, and they'll express this so-called HER2 new receptor. And all of those receptors have drugs that can block them from keeping the cells from growing. And so they're tools. When a cell is so deranged, it looks nothing like a breast cell. It has none of those receptors. Therefore, it's called triple negative, right? So it has no receptors that if you put it under a slide, it just looks like it could be any cancer because it's that aggressive.
Wow.
And when you do it, it doesn't have these markers. So those are just hyper resistant to any therapy. And as what we've discussed, we're now applying immunotherapy to those tumors because it's not about what drug you use, it's can the immune cell detect those tumors as abnormal and eradicate them like it might do in this case of the pancreas cancer that we talked about. But in general, we're in a great state of understanding, one, how to treat breast cancer, how to detect it early, and then have selective and targeted mechanisms to prevent it from coming back.
So let's move next to a men's cancer, prostate cancer. Tell us where we are on that.
We are, you can have a conversation with a urologist probably for an entire day about the options to treat prostate cancer.
So it seems.
So 90% survival in 5 years for breast cancer. We'll take prostate cancer and talk about 90% survival over 10 years. So very, very treatable through PSA, which is still used, MRI to help us understand who's truly got a lesion that is a cancer. And really the decision around prostate cancer now is who actually needs treatment, right? Because there are studies from populations in the UK and in Europe and even America, that says if you get a population of men who are over 80, somewhere around 75 to 85% will have some prostate cancer cells in their prostate. So it's a disease that occurs as you get older, but in general, there is a host of people who will not die of their prostate cancer. And so we have this process now called watchful waiting. So we have cohorts of men who've had biopsies, and we've said, you know what? This is not going to hurt you. We're going to look at it, and we're going to check your PSA on an annual basis, and we're going to make sure that it stays stable. But we're not going to take your prostate out in this current setting because there's really no proof that this is going to be the thing that ends your life. If you do want to treat, it goes from prostate surgery, which has now become quite remarkably successful. It goes from high-intensity ultrasound, now that can focus it to attack cells that are localized. It goes to radiation therapy, radiation oncology that can be very targeted and directed with limited side effects. And so you have an immense number of ways to do it. And now we've developed tools that even if you've done your treatment and your prostate cancer comes back, we have this platform now called theranostics. It's when we take a specific antibody that is targeted to a marker on a cell and use it to have a emitter to light up to tell us where the cells are. So we can have somebody who we know their prostate cancers come back. We use this antibody against a protein called prostate membrane specific antigen, PMSA. It may light up the cells all over your body. And so we know where it is. And we can either give you a drug, and then at some points, these drugs no longer work, and that the most difficult prostate cancers are those that are driven by testosterone. And when they become even more difficult is when they don't respond, that by blocking the testosterone, they still grow, right? So that becomes a cancer that's now sort of lost its mind. The regular fuel, it doesn't need. It's just going to grow from anything around it. We then have now a tool where we put a radioactive particle on the antibody. And that radioactive particle now goes and sights out every cell and attacks those cells to kill them specifically. So there's a really growing platform of theranostics now that can attack the most difficult forms of prostate cancer. And then you have all these options for those that are standard, that are still localized for treatment. So for the common ones, those two, breast and prostate, we've done a really good job.
Right. And let's move to children. I think of two that come to my mind. One is leukemia, and the other is, it feels like I've known a disproportionate number of children who have had neoblastomas.
Okay.
So can you just comment on each of those?
So there's a neuroblastoma, and then there's a leukemia. And
neuroblastoma, yeah.
So early on, leukemias in children are typically truly genetically driven. So for kids who get cancer, it's not this somatic mutation. It's really often something that they may have inherited or early on in their development have had a mutation in a gene. And they were pretty difficult to treat. And they're still, when they come along, they take special attention. We actually treat more children for cancer than any hospital in America now. But in general, the survival for pediatric cancers is greater than 80%. So we have a remarkable ability to have targeted drugs, stem cell or bone marrow transplants to fight these tumors. And in the case of neuroblastoma, really outstanding drugs now to attack them in a powerful way. So I think that we continually fight and make a big difference in children's cancers, even though the ones you see are so sad. And largely they're driven by a genetic profile. Mm-hmm. And from that, we often find drugs that are particularly safe, but uniquely can be applied. So complicated tumors, because that we have this sequencing platform called MSK Impact, and people can look at that platform from across the world and know that we have a number of genes that have been identified in cancer. And a young girl in actually Bangladesh had a rare breast cancer at 13. She actually was being treated in a global health clinic by some doctors at Vanderbilt who knew about the trial that we had at MSK because we had identified a specific marker from our genetic profile, and they sent her to MSK, and we were able, because of this mutation that we'd identified in kids and adults, she was able to get treatment that really melted her tumor away. Even when you come in and you have a difficult tumor, we will sequence that tumor and then use data scientists to go through and ask where is the best chance for a marker that can actually be targeted by a drug. And right now, Mark, the drug doesn't have to be intended for that cancer. Many of the drugs that we use were developed, and what they were found to be in phase 1 is safe. They didn't cause any bad side effects, but they also were found to be ineffective. So they didn't go forward, right? Because their intent, although well-intended, they didn't have the impact. Well, we can often take those drugs that were intended for something else, discover that they actually work for this mutation. We know they're safe, so they won't create really undue harm, and we can apply these for the new tumor mutations we discover.
Right. What a remarkable set of stories. You know, because it's such a pervasive set of conversations that one has every day almost at times with people who are facing in their family or in themselves or in colleagues or neighbors concerns about cancer diagnoses. It is just really remarkable to hear these stories, which is why I wanted to have this chance to talk with you. I also know that you know, the existential experience of cancer is so powerful and it's distinct in my experience over time. It's everybody takes the road in their own particular way, and in the face of whatever other extenuating circumstances are going on in their life, whatever their social location may be, whatever their economic, racial placement may be in the world, that shapes how all this experience really unfolds in a very, very significant way. I wonder if you could just comment on the non-bodily, the more social, the social factors that are part of cancer.
We were the first place sort of cancer hospital in the world to develop a platform for psycho-oncology. It is so clear to me, but I think to many of our practitioners, that there is certainly a malady that a person has when they develop a cancer. Uniquely compared to any other setting, though, people perceive that malady truly to threaten their very existence. So every patient who walks through our door has a diagnosis that they know and believe can take their lives away if they're not helped by us.
Yes.
And along that journey, you know, probably right now, 63 to 64% of the time, we can get people to that window of 5 years to say, we don't think you have any more tumors. Now, some of them will recur after 5 years, but we still have about 45% of people who we cannot get there. And even those who we get there along the journey, they often have to ask some hard questions about their faith, wherever it may lie, and why and what's going to happen. It truly is it's a struggle often to walk through that, because you're hard pressed to point out what anybody did or what happened or why this would occur. And so it's so important to have a healthy environment that everybody recognizes the battle that patient is fighting. One of the more profound stories I had, I try to meet with our frontline staff on a monthly basis. And I met with our food services team. And one of the young ladies there talked about her journey from just being a frontline server, where she first started 25 years ago, just serving food in the cafeteria, and gradually grew to a supervisory role of where she oversaw the delivery of food to a patient's room. And she said, you know, what I enjoy, but what I own the responsibility for, is when a patient gets a tray and what they ordered is not on that tray. And I often go there and they're really frustrated and angry because they ordered chocolate Ensure and they got strawberry. They wanted pudding. They got cake. She said, what I realize is that these people who are in our hospital, everything in their world of control has been taken from them.
Yes, yes.
And the one thing they can control is what food they choose to eat. And it's my job to give them that control back. It's my job to make sure that for this little thing, when nothing else can they control, not whether they live or whether they are able to fight or win this battle, I give back to them the right to choose what they get to have on their tray.
Right.
And I correct it when I go up to make sure they get what they ask for. I thought that was profound in the example of the environment and the type of emotional support that is so important for our patients to receive,
right,
to both to encourage their faith if they have it, and to give them a sense of caring for those who don't, that this group of individuals at where we serve will do all that we can to make their journey one where they know they're cared for, and two, that we're going to do everything within our medical power skills to fight their cancer.
Yes. It underscores that cancer treatment is a team sport.
Yeah.
And in every case where people have had, I would say, just anecdotally, of course, a sense of resilience, it has been strengthened by a sense of team that are around them, encouraging them, responding to those kinds of specifics that you just named, but also to the wider realities of whatever a person may be going through between treatments or so forth. It's really such an isolating condition for many, and then to have a community of people that actually surround and support people closely, honestly, in that process can make an enormous difference.
It does. Recently at an event, we shared a video. One of our patients fighting ovarian cancer ran the New York City Marathon after her surgery, and the team around her ran with her. And they were inspired, knowing what she'd gone through and what hills she had climbed. They were inspired. I think our patients actually often help us because we see the grace by which they often handle that journey, not knowing what the end would hold. And it's an amazing impact on the lives of our practitioners, and whether that's the nursing, environmental services, the doctors, the fellows, all benefit from both the impact that patients have along their journey, as well as what good we try to do to them.
I don't know if you've seen it. It was a film that was made a number of years ago that was called WIT, W-I-T. It was first a play on Broadway, and then it got made into a screenplay by Emma Thompson, who played the lead character of a woman who has fourth-stage metastatic cancer. And it's a film that I have often thought every doctor and nurse should watch, because in that case, in a way very different than what you're describing, really Emma Thompson's character goes through this largely alone.
Oh my goodness.
And you feel the starkness of the medicine. Obviously, the medicine would now seem, I'm sure, very dated, but the sense of what the process is about is not dated, because people are still existentially going through this in a lot of the same ways. It's a film that came out of one play, as I mentioned, which was written by a woman in Washington, D.C., who only wrote one play, as I understand it, in her whole life, which became this play and film. And it spotlights literally the kind of stages of the process. The story of the woman that Emma Thompson plays dies, and it's all handled in an extremely candid way where the character turns and actually talks directly to the camera about what's going on inside her while she's actually going through various treatments and experiencing various procedures and personnel in the hospitals. And it interacts with her academic life, because she's studying the poetry of John Donne, and John Donne has written quite a lot about death and the question of whether death is, as is stated at one stage, whether death is a comma or death is a semicolon. And the argument of her professor is that Donne would say death is a comma. You've been proximate to so many efforts that have to do with how you sustain life. But obviously that's also meant facing death at very close proximity, as I have done, not as a doctor, but certainly as a pastor. And I guess I wonder what words you would share about cancer deaths and your reflections, both out of your own personal faith, but also out of your profession.
Yeah, one of my early experiences, I was a medical student at Johns Hopkins, and I remember getting early in my surgical training. And in fact, I was in my last year of medical school doing a surgical, what it was called, acting internship. So I was given the opportunity to function as a first-year doctor. And I was consulted to see a patient who was dying from metastatic cancer. And because he had some fluid in his chest, they wanted the surgery team to see if it could be drained. And what was very obvious was that nobody wanted to go in his room. They were all talking about his case. It was as if room was sort of a no-fly zone. And it was also obvious that people were struggling with what to say or what would their engagement be, because they had nothing left to offer.
Right.
And I really had a sort of overwhelming conviction that because as a person of faith, as a Christian, that I actually had something to offer, that I could, if nothing best, listen, but at most offer that from my personal belief, there was something, if you would, after death. So I went in his room, and as in the case in so many of these times, I had very little to encourage him. He simply needed someone to listen to him, and he encouraged me. He had made this perspective, if he said, peace with God, about where he was and what was going to happen. And it was a powerful experience just to hear him share, and also to realize all he wanted was someone to listen. He wasn't looking at this stage for anybody to do any new therapy. He just wanted a listening ear, even if they didn't agree with him. He just wanted someone to listen. Mm-hmm. And I found that to be profound, both in the sense that I can and should have a perspective of what it means to have the challenge of walking a patient through death, and to share what my personal feeling is, but also to realize and understand where they are and help them accept whatever they choose. And in this case, it was him really encouraging me for having a little bit of courage to walk in his room, and not so much to blurt out what was on my mind, but just to be willing to listen to what he had to say, which was profound.
Right. So often at any pain point in people's lives, having the courage to listen is a critical ingredient.
Yes.
Whatever the drama may be. You know, I grew up in the Northwest, and I was very aware of all the cancer research and heart research, especially, that was going on in Seattle, which made it a good place because my family genes have more to do with heart disease than they do with cancer. But in any case, as it became common that people were having bone marrow transplants, there was this one doctor at Fred Hutch that had written an article about the fact that he had been as close as anyone to this whole bone marrow process.
Great cancer center.
And then suddenly he has a need of it. And he writes this article about how he completely did not understand what the experience was, that he thought he understood it because he'd been so close to it. But then he has the actual treatments himself and realizes it's just almost something other than what he had understood it to be, as close as he'd been. Anyway, he wrote this article, which I remember reading and just being really, really fascinated by. I have never been able to find that article. And I just was throwing that out just to see, does that trigger any memory of any such?
There are multiple scenarios like that. And as much as I describe, hopefully in an empathetic way, walking with someone who has that diagnosis, it is profoundly different when a physician has been diagnosed with cancer and has to go through the therapy. Every one of us can write a book in a profound way. I have a close friend who developed a highly resistant and malignant leukemia, and he had to go through a complete stem cell transplant. And it was for him, there were multiple near-death experiences, not just one, multiple times that he felt like he was no longer for this world. So when a physician goes through that, and there have been multiple occasions,
Yes,
it
I'm
is
sure.
unbelievably profound because you think you know what your patient's going through. And then once you're there, and sometimes it's not just you, but it's when a true loved one, a
Right.
spouse, a child,
Right.
and it's often even harder, right?
Right.
You can somehow sort of recuse yourself of wanting too much when it's you and just accept what happens.
Yes.
You often can't refuse giving up when it's someone who you care about.
Right,
You want to
right.
fight when they don't want to fight. And so those two events are just transformative in people's lives, either close loved ones who are going through it or they themselves having to go through it.
Wow. Amazing. Selwyn, this has just been such an honor. And I do thank you on behalf of all of the people that are being served by Memorial Sloan Kettering, but also doctors around the country and around the world that are doing this kind of scientific research that is critical for our future. And we just really can't let anything get in the way of this kind of ongoing development of science and its incredible importance to all of us. And I'm inspired and have been inspired through our other conversations at other times to hear how, as a person of faith, you walk both as a faithful scientist and as a faithful Christian into these holistic spaces where it's always much more than the body and not less than the body. And it's just been a gift to have you today. We're having this conversation, I should point out, and recording it on Good Friday in 2025. And I don't think there was a master plan behind that, but I find it a sweet irony.
Yeah, I do as well. Mark, it's been a pleasure. I think certainly who I am in totality is based as a physician, scientist of faith, and a leader who very much is a person seeking to make a difference to serve others out of the ethos of what I believe and what I think has been done for me that I want to see done for others.
Amen. Thank you again.
My pleasure.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.